nVidia is really good at making GPUs, and undeniably, they're also really good at giving us weird and perplexing GPU announcements sometimes. And today, we got one of those. Today, nVidia released what they're calling the GeForce RTX 5060 family. So the RTX 5060 and 5060 Ti GPU. These are interesting GPUs because they're way on the low end of the current 5000 series, obviously with 5090 being the king, and these GPUs kind of being the feudal serfs of their product line. It's not really clear what these are good for. Really, they're meant for lower resolution gaming, and given the advent of local AI, the lower end of NVIDIA GPUs is a really interesting space, especially with a lot of the software tooling that's going on that enables people to do more with less VRAM, especially with GPUs that are getting a little bit faster. So I want to dive into what these GPUs are actually good for, whether or not they're actually a good value given their price and availability. I want to compare them to the previous generation 4060 and 4060 Ti, and see what you can actually do with these, and basically understand if this is something you should buy if you want to use this GPU for local AI. So welcome to AI Flux. Let's get into it. These two GPUs in theory will be available in about a month, and their prices are really good. I'm just going to say it. The price at which you can buy these at MSRP, likely with more availability, is better than what you can pay for most 4060s and 4060 Ti's on eBay. But the biggest question is the capability of these GPUs, and the lower end of NVIDIA product specs has always been a really bizarre space. You'll see all kinds of different VRAM specs, very perplexing amounts of RAM being pushed back and forth, and most videos you'll find on YouTube are just people being really weirded out why NVIDIA released this. But I think there's some interesting attributes to unpack, so let's jump into the hardware first. For reference, I'm really making this video about the 5060 Ti, not the 5060. 8 gigs of VRAM is just not enough in 2025 to be doing local AI, especially with a GPU you're buying brand new. So with that in mind, let's look at the GPU itself. So the GPU itself actually is very, very similar to the die that was used on the 4060, aside from the NVENC encoder, which mostly does video stuff. So you still have 5th gen tensor cores, you still have basically the same streaming multiprocessors, and the same ray tracing cores, which of course, the only bits of this you're going to use for local AI are pretty much the tensor cores. The performance is pretty interesting when you compare it to previous generations, and it's cool that NVIDIA's already included the 3060 Ti in it. And of course, these are gaming benchmarks, but some of this still carries over to some real performance. They mention a subsection here for AI PCs, so NVIDIA is clearly marketing these to AI creators or people who use AI as creators, but they don't really give much insight, and I think they might have done that for a reason. The specs that we really want to look at are here, and it's great that they actually let us select the 4060 to compare directly against. So what we really want to look at here is AI tops. Basically, this is the number of AI computations or computations relative to AI, like LLMs or generative AI, that the GPU can run per second. If we look at the 4060 Ti, basically this GPU in theory should have about twice the relative performance of the 4060 and 4060 Ti, which is a great argument to say never buy old hardware. However, the benchmarks kind of paint a different picture, and we'll get into that in just a bit. Other than that, there aren't a lot of interesting things to look at here. There is both an 8 and 16 gigabyte version of the 5060 Ti. Only buy the 16 gig version. Do not buy any version of this with 8 gigs of RAM. Just don't do it. The other really cool thing that potentially could be great for local AI is memory bandwidth. So the amount of memory you have is important, but what's more important is how quickly the GPU can actually send information back and forth from this RAM, which directly affects how many tokens per second you're getting out of, let's say, a local LLM you're running. So the 4060 Ti had around 288 gigabytes per second, and the 5060 and 5060 Ti have around 450 gigabytes per second. So not necessarily a 2x speed up, but just about there. And this is, generally speaking, the biggest advancement you'll find between generations of NVIDIA GPUs when you're not looking at the high end. RAM just gets so much faster every year, and this is actually a big win. This is something that you'll see even if you get 24 gigs of VRAM on a super low-end old GPU like the P40. VRAM's size does not scale linearly based on the speed. So the most bandwidth you can get is great, and it's looking really good for the 5060 Ti so far. nVidia also touts significant performance increases with their new driver, which of course you have to use if you're going to use this latest GPU. The Linux support is quite good, And it'll be interesting to see if we see differences between Linux and Windows with this, especially with the advent of nVidia making big pushes to make AI on Windows OCL a big thing. I still say just use Linux, but for some of you who like to game as well, yeah, it's a pretty good option. And I should say that in theory, if you're doing like 1080p gaming or really casual gaming, this is a great option for that. So if you want to have a PC you can do both with and you don't want to spend a lot of money, in my opinion, if it's available, this is a okay option for that. And I say okay being less than good, but we'll get into that in just a bit. So in terms of benchmarks, things are interesting. And today, nVidia dropped their media embargo as well. So we've gotten to see some really interesting data from a number of reviewers. This is coming from Tom's Hardware. And you'll see here, this is Stable Diffusion XL wrapped into a benchmark score. And it's interesting to see where this GPU falls. And honestly, I was a little disappointed. I will say I'm less disappointed because the RTX 4070 actually is available now for like $1,000 on secondhand markets, which is insane. So this GPU, in theory, if you were buying it at MSRP, makes a little bit more sense. But frankly, the performance improvement in Gen AI coming from the 4060 Ti 16GB is only about 12%. So even though you have twice the bandwidth and a GPU that in theory is quite a bit faster in terms of AI tops, the performance in reality is not quite there, which is one reason why I might not recommend you buy this GPU for local AI. I'm going to link below Phoronix's benchmarks. These are mostly Linux tied. And there are a lot of kind of workflow-based systems. There's OpenCL benchmarks, there's a lot of 3D rendering benchmarks. Frankly, Blender benchmarks track pretty well with a lot of LLM performance in terms of how they use memory and kind of stress the GPU. But what I'll say here is if we look at aggregate scores, the 5060 Ti is still basically at the end of the pack and behind the RTX 4070, which isn't that much better and has the same amount of RAM. So if you're looking at RAM and you're looking at a number of factors, I'm probably still gonna say opt for the 5070 Ti 16 gig if you can afford it, or probably still opt for an RTX 3090 with 24 gigs of RAM. That is also easier to double up on after the fact. And these GPUs are pretty inexpensive. You can get them for about the same price or less than an RTX 4070 on eBay, and they're okay for gaming. In terms of price, obviously, nVidia is saying that the MSRP for these will be about $379 for the 5060 Ti and around $300 for the 5060. Now, I don't think we're gonna see these show up at MSRP. I think we'll see probably like 120% MSRP, which has been the case with most of the new NVIDIA GPUs. But it gets interesting when you start looking at the price of the previous generation. Now, part of this is just because of what's going on in China with tariffs and an overall kind of question of how long we'll be able to really import stuff from Taiwan, where NVIDIA produces effectively all of their GPUs, and from China, where all these GPUs are assembled. So that said, you can find pretty good deals, right? Like here's a 4060 Ti 8 gig, which you wouldn't want to use for AI, that's $370. All the 16 gig cards are basically over $500 or even $600, which is a little bit ridiculous. And these are from just this week. So these are all sold on April 15th of 2025. So based on pricing, I would not buy a used 16 gig 4060 Ti for anything over $400. And even then, that is a case where I would buy the new 5060 Ti. In any other case, I'm going to reference my gold standard for value in kind of entry-level GPUs for local AI, both for generative AI and LLMs, which is the 3090 24 gig. I think it's cool to see NVIDIA try new things. It's cool that they're trying to make GPUs that are affordable for the masses. But when it comes to local AI, there are a few really specific things you have to look for. And this is one example where on the lower end of GPUs, even if you see what appears to be a substantive increase in performance, it's just not always translated into real world performance. And what is great is that there has never been more tooling to run thinking models, to run large language models, and especially Gen AI models locally with way less RAM, with way more improvement in performance. So I'd say if you can't really stick it out and save up more for a 3090, maybe opt for something like a 4070 or a 4070 Super that you found a really good deal on. But for now, unfortunately, my conclusion is I would not buy the NVIDIA 5060 Ti, even with 16 gigs of DDR7 RAM for local AI. I'm just gonna be honest with you guys. So if you disagree with my opinion here, you think the 3090 is not a great value, or you have a better build you wanna recommend, or something you want me to check out, leave it in the comments below. As always, I hope you learned something in this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.